She was 36 and widowed since May, when the creditors settled her husband's account. One of them laughed before the ink was dry. There was no money in it, no wages, no interest, no share of the last contracts. All she carried out was a straightening hammer with a beechwood handle, worn pale where John Wayne's thumb had sat. The house owed her £19 11 shillings. What she got was a deed to the old needleworks at the edge of Sheffield. Empty 12 years. Roof open to the rain. But what Edward Vane did not know was that in a small upstairs room at the end of the north passage, behind a door swollen shut with damp, something had sat through 12 winters that had no business still being there. It would change more than what she was worth. It would change what half the fine steel leaving Sheffield passed through before it was packed. Tell me in the comments. Were you ever handed something everyone else had given up on? The settlement was held on the 14th of October, 1866, in a back office on Bank Street, in a room with a coal fire that nobody had bothered to bank up since morning. Sarah Wain had walked in from Neepsend in the rain, and she sat with her boots wet through and her shawl over the back of the chair to dry, because there was nowhere else to put it. There were 3 men on the other side of the table. Edward Vane, 48, a merchant in fine steel goods, sat in the middle with a folder of papers squared in front of him. Gideon Cropper, 51, a coal factor who had supplied Harrow Fold for 9 years, sat at the end with his hat on his knee. A clerk named Alfred Sowerby, 24, wrote at a side desk and did not look up once in the whole of it. Vane went through the schedule in order, because that was how such things were done. The machinery had gone to the bank in Change Alley, and the steel in stock had gone to a merchant in Rotherham. The horses, the cart, the leather belting, and the office fittings had been sold in one lot in August. The contracts with 2 London houses had been bought by another firm for a sum that Vane read out and did not explain. What remained, when all of that had been counted and set against what the firm owed, was not money. The estate cannot pay the last quarter in coin, Vane said. Sarah asked what it could pay in. Vane turned the folder round so that she could see it and put one finger on the 3rd column. There was a property at Harrow Fold, on the Loxley side of the town, held freehold. It had been the firm's first works, and it had been shut up in '54 when the business moved into town, and it had stood since then with nobody in it, but a watchman who came past twice a week and had stopped coming past at all in '62. The valuation was written in the margin in pencil. Against it, in the same pencil, somebody had written the figure of her husband's account, £19 11 shillings, and drawn a line under both. The land alone answers the debt, Vane said. On paper, it more than answers it. Cropper laughed then, into his hat, and said the bricks might fetch something. Sarah looked at the pencil line for a while, and she was not thinking about bricks, but about the fact that a firm which could not find £19 could find a way to write a sentence in which it owed her nothing. She asked how many years the works had stood empty, and Vane said 12. She asked whether there was a key, and Vane said he believed the doors were barred from inside and that she would want a man with a crow. Sowerby wrote out a note to the smith on the lane who held the yard gate padlock and blotted it, and that was the whole of her inheritance. A deed, a note to a smith, and an address. She signed with the pen they gave her, and Cropper had gone before she had her shawl on. Sarah Wain had spent 18 years looking at the surface of steel, which was not a trade anybody in Sheffield thought worth giving a name to. She had gone into Wardlow's on Arundel Street at 14 in 1844. In a room where the work of finishing needles was done by women at long benches for 9 and 10 hours a day. She began at the washing trough, and after a year she was moved to straightening, which meant laying needles on a flat plate and rolling them under a bar until every one of them lay true, and after that to sorting, which meant grading by length and eye and point, and after that, at 17, to the bench by the north window, where the finished work was looked at before it was papered. That was the bench that mattered. The forewoman there was a woman called Anne Faraday, 61 by then, who had been in needles since she was 9, and who had a way of not answering a question for a full minute before she answered it. Anne Faraday taught her to set a lamp low and to the side, so that the light ran along the length of a needle instead of falling across it, because a mark that you cannot see in flat daylight will stand up like a ridge when the light comes along the metal. She taught her the colors that steel takes when it is tempered, straw and brown and purple and blue, and what each one meant about the heat it had been through. She taught her the difference between a stain that will come off with emery and a stain that has gone into the steel and will not. On the day Sarah turned 20, Anne Faraday gave her a flat tin box with a strip of steel inside it, blued at one end and straw at the other, with the colors running along it in bands. "Light along it, not across it," she said. "The steel will tell you the rest." Sarah kept the tin. She married John Wain in 1852, when she was 22, and their daughter Mary was born the next year. John had been 3 years in a dry, grinding hull before he got out of it and into finishing. And those 3 years were what killed him, though it took 13 more to do it. He worked at Harrow Fold's town premises as a hardener and finisher of fine needles and small steel articles, and he was good enough that they kept him on through 2 slack winters. He coughed from the autumn of '64 onward. He died on the 2nd of May, 1866, and was buried at Wardsend, and the firm sent nobody. There is a thing that happens to a woman in that trade when her husband dies. The work she did before her marriage is still there, but it is paid at 7 shillings a week now instead of 9, and it is given out first to the young ones who can be worked hardest. Sarah had been taking in sorting at home since June, at a rate that came to about 5 shillings a week if the light was good, and Mary helped in the evenings. Her rent in Neepsend was 3 shillings. That was the arithmetic she was sitting on when she signed Vane's paper, and it is why she signed, because the alternative was walking out of Bank Street with nothing. If somebody handed you a dead workshop with rain coming down the stairs, would you sell the bricks and be done with it? Or would you go up and look in every room first? Tell me in the comments which one you would have done, because Sarah did the second, and by the 3rd day she had found the room, and by the 3rd week she had stopped sleeping properly. She went out to Harrow Fold on the 17th, with Mary, who was 13 that year and carried the lantern. It was a wet week even by Sheffield standards, and the work stood at the end of a cart track off the Loxley Road in a bend of the river, with the wheelgoit running behind it under a mat of dead weed. There was a yard with a gate, and the range ran along 2 sides of it. 2 stories, blackened brick, with the slate off in 3 places along the north side and the rafters showing like the bones of a hand. A chimney stood at the west end, taller than the building, and out of proportion to it, the way old works chimneys often are. The windows had been broken by boys years ago, and grass grew out of the gutters, and there was a bird cherry, 10 feet high, growing out of the corner where the downspout had come away. The smith on the lane, a man called Robert Ackroyd, 47, came up with a crow and took the padlock off the gate for nothing, and then stayed a minute and said what everyone said, which was that it was a shame. Inside was worse than outside, and the ground floor had been the grinding shop. The floor, the hulls were still there. The long stone troughs where the grinding wheels had run in water, with the wheels themselves gone, and the frames gone, and only the mountings left. There was water lying in the troughs, and the line shafting that had driven the wheels ran the length of the ceiling, and it was solid rust. The pulleys locked on it, the whole thing furred and swollen, and dropping flakes when she touched it. The floor was mud, in places where the roof had failed. Rainwater came down the stone stairs at the north end, and had been coming down them long enough to cut a channel through the dirt on each tread. Everything made of iron or steel in that building had gone red. The nails standing out of the fallen laths, the hooks in the beams, the straps on the doors, a pair of pliers that somebody had left on a sill in 1854 and never come back for, was a lump with a shape to it and nothing more. Sarah went through the ground floor and up the stairs and along the upper range, and it was the same in every room. Rust on the window catches, rust on the barrel hoops, rust on a spade left leaning in a corner. She was not shocked by it. She had expected it. Because that is what happens to steel in a building where the rain gets in and the air never moves. She began an inventory on the second day, on the back pages of a receipt book, in pencil, because she had come out there to find out what could be sold. She wrote down the lead from the valley gutters. She wrote down the shafting and the pulleys as scrap iron, and the broken cast hulls, and the fire grates, and about 400 square feet of floorboard in the south range that was still sound, and the roof timbers over the two worst rooms, which would have to come off anyway. She wrote down the brick as a rough count and did not trust her own figure. She sat on the stairs at noon with bread and cold bacon, and Mary counted the panes that were still whole, and there were 51 out of 116. The door at the end of the north passage on the upper floor would not open. It was not locked, and there was a keyhole and no key. But the door moved a quarter of an inch in the frame when she pushed it and stopped dead, and the frame had a swelling along one side where the wet had got into the wood and lifted it. She left it that day and came back on the third day with Ackroyd's crow, which he had let her keep for the week, and put the flat of it in above the latch and worked the door until the frame split and let go. The first thing was the smell, which was not the smell of the rest of the building. The rest of the building smelled of wet soot and rotten timber and river. This room smelled of dust and old wood and nothing else. It was a small room, about 18 feet by 12, on the north side, with 2 windows shuttered from the inside, and a third window boarded. There were 3 long benches with tops of scarred elm, a rack of wooden sorting trays, 4 barrels standing under the far window, a stone jar with a broken neck, and a good deal of paper on the floor, some of it accounts, most of it the buff wrappers that finished needles used to be papered in. There was dust over all of it, thick and even and gray, the kind that takes years to lie down like that. There was a spider's web across the corner of the nearest bench, with a dead fly in it that had been dead a long time, and on the second bench, in a shallow wooden tray, were needles. There were perhaps 300 or 400 of them, unfinished, lying in loose ranks the way they lie when a tray has been set down mid-work and not picked up. Sarah looked at them from the doorway for a moment before she came any closer, because she knew what she was looking at, and she did not believe it. They were gray. Not red, not brown, not pitted, but gray, and dry, and clean. She set the lantern on the bench and took one up between her finger and thumb and turned it and put the light along it the way Anne Faraday had taught her 20 years before. There was no rust on it at all, only a faint dullness on the surface, the sort of bloom that comes on steel that has been sitting. But underneath the bloom the metal was sound, and when she drew it once across the pad of her thumb it did not drag. She bent it slowly between her fingers until it took a set and then sprang most of the way back, which told her it was needle steel and hardened, and not iron wire and not anything else. Then she looked down at the tray and saw that the dust in it was undisturbed, except where her own hand had just been, and that under the needle she had lifted there was a needle-shaped line of clean elm where no dust had ever fallen. Nobody had moved it, and nobody had been in that room for years. She stayed in the room until the light went, and she went out to it again the next morning before Mary was awake, and for 4 days after that she did nothing but try to prove herself wrong. Her first thought was that the needles were not steel. Some makers had sold silvered and plated goods for the Spanish trade, and a plated needle will not rust because the steel underneath it never touches the air. So she took one and rubbed the middle of it with a scrap of emery paper until she had taken the surface down, and the metal under it was the same gray as the metal over it. Then she snapped one in half and put the lamp along the broken end. A plating shows at a cut end as a line, the way the rind shows on a cheese. There was no line. It was steel, through and through, hardened and tempered, and by the color at the break, it had been tempered rather well. Her second thought was that somebody had left the stock there recently, that the tray had come up from the town in the last year or two, put out of the way by a man who meant to come back for it. The papers on the floor answered that. The wrappers were printed with the name Fenwick and Harrow, which had not been the name of the firm since '49. There were 2 loose leaves of a workshop account with dates in the spring of 1853 on them, and the dust answered it better than the papers did. Dust does not lie down evenly in a year, and it does not lie down under a needle set on the bench after it, and every needle in that tray had a clean line of elm beneath it. Her third thought was oil. Every finisher in Sheffield knew that a wipe of oil will hold rust off steel for a season, and that needles were often dressed before they were papered. But oil left 12 years does not stay oil. It goes gummy, and it goes dark, and it takes the dust and holds it, and it smells. Sarah drew 6 needles across a clean square of rag, and the rag stayed white. She laid one on a sheet of paper overnight, and there was no mark on the paper in the morning. Whatever was keeping them, it was not a dressing anybody had put on them. Her fourth thought was the one she wanted to be true, which was that somebody had been using the room. That was answered by the door. She had split the frame herself to get in. The web across the bench corner had been unbroken, and there was no track in the dust, except her own. So she came at it the other way round, and that is when she stopped looking at the needles. She fetched things up from the rest of the works and set them on the bench beside the tray. A hinge off the door of the packing room, scaled and swollen. 4 nails out of a fallen lath, red the whole way round. A barrel hoop from the ground floor that came apart in her hands. She put them in a row, and then she went round the polishing room itself and looked at the iron in it. The catches on the 2 shuttered windows were dark but sound, and the screws in them still had slots you could put a driver into. The hoops on the 4 barrels under the window were dull, gray, and whole. The nails in the bench tops had a bloom on them, and no scale. There was a small pair of tongs in the drawer of the second bench, with a thin brown film on the handles and clean steel at the tips. It was not the needles at all. It was the room. That was the 14th day. And it was the day she took 6 needles home in the tin that Anne Faraday had given her. She put 3 of them on the sill of her own kitchen window in Neepsend, on a saucer, and she left 3 in the tin on the shelf, and she wrote the date on the flyleaf of the receipt book. 11 days later, the 3 on the saucer had gone spotted along the length, brown in 5 or 6 places on each, the way any bright steel goes in a Sheffield kitchen, with a copper boiling twice a week. The 3 in the tin were as they had been. She wrote that down too. Then she walked out to Harrow Fold in the dark with a lantern, because she wanted to sit in that room and think about the fact that the works had stood open to the weather for 12 years and one room in it had not. The first thing that told her anything was a scrap of paper. It was one of the buff wrappers, caught under the leg of the 3rd bench with its corner hanging free, about 4 inches of it. And the free corner was not still. It moved, though not in any way you would have seen from the door. It trembled, and lay back and trembled again, the way a leaf does when there is a draft along the floor. Both windows were shuttered, and the shutters were pegged. The boarded window had been boarded from inside with 3 planks, and the planks were sound. The door was shut behind her. She put the candle on the floor near the skirting and watched the flame. It leaned, and it leaned toward the wall, and it leaned steadily. And when she moved the candle 3 feet along the wall, it leaned there too. Sarah went down on her knees with the lantern and went along the north side of that room with her face 6 inches from the boards, and found the second thing, which was the dust. It was not even after all. Along a strip about 2 feet wide at the foot of the north wall, the gray was thin, and in one place near the corner, it was hardly there. In the far corner by the barrels, the boards had the bloom of old damp on them, the faint stippling that comes and goes with the seasons, and along the north strip there was none of that at all. She knocked along the floor with the handle of the crow. Most of it answered dull. A run of 5 boards near the north wall answered hollow, and answered hollow along their whole length, which is not what a joist under a board sounds like. It took her the better part of an afternoon to get the first board up without splitting it, because the nails were old and the heads had gone. Underneath was not a cellar and not a hiding place. It was a space, about 9 inches deep, floored with brick laid flat, running the length of the room, and it was dry. Not damp, not slimed, dry, with a little dry rubbish in it, and a mouse's nest 20 years dead. At the west end, the space narrowed into a brick channel about 7 inches square that went away under the wall toward the chimney. At the east end, another channel came in from the outside wall, and it had daylight in it. A thin gray line of it, far off. She put her hand down into the space and held it there. She could feel the air on the back of her hand. The third thing was the wall. The lime wash on the north wall had blown in patches, and behind one patch, where the plaster had come away, the brickwork was not solid. There was a narrow vertical passage in the thickness of it, about 4 inches by 9, running up. She tapped along that wall and found the hollow note again in 3 places, all of them running up toward the west end of the room, toward the chimney stack. And she went outside in the rain and stood at the foot of the stack and looked up at it and thought about the fact that a chimney that tall had been built for a works that had never had more than one small furnace in it. Sarah Wain was not an engineer, and she did not become one. What she had was a fixed habit of looking at a surface and asking what had happened to it, and she turned that habit on a building instead of on a needle, which is the only unusual thing she ever did. The account leaves gave her the next piece, though she nearly threw them away twice. There were 7 of them altogether, 4 from under the bench, and 3 more that she found in the drawer of a table in the room below, and they were nothing but a workshop spending, written in a clerk's hand, for parts of the years 52 and 53. Most of it was ordinary. Emery, 3 sorts. Soft soap, bran, buff leather, sawdust by the load, coal. Then, scattered through it, entries that had no place in a needle account at all. Perforated zinc, 2 sheets, lime, 1 bushel for the north room, sweeping and repointing of the brick flues, 3 shillings and 6pence, drying racks, season deal, to Mr. Fenwick's pattern, tin oxide, 4 pounds weight, louvre boards renewed, north wall, 2 shillings and 9pence. She copied all 6 entries into the receipt book and sat with them for 2 evenings. And then she made her mistake. What she decided was that the room had been sealed. Lime in a tight room, she thought. She knew that a bushel of lime in a corner will take the wet out of the air of a small room, because her mother had kept a dish of it in a cellar for exactly that reason, and here was lime in the account. And here was a room where steel would not rust, and the ceiling part fitted too. Or so it seemed to her, because the door had been swollen shut and the shutters pegged and one window boarded up, and that was why the damp had never got in. So she spent money on it. She bought a bushel of fresh lime from a lime burner at Wadsley for 1 shilling and 9pence, and she carried it out in 2 sacks over 2 days, and she set it in a wooden trough in the corner. She pegged the shutters tighter. She stuffed a sack into the mouth of the channel at the east end of the underfloor space, the one with the daylight in it, because that was plainly where the outside air was getting in, and outside air in Sheffield in November is wet air. She put the board back down over it. She swept the room out, and she set a fresh tray of 40 needles from the old stock on the middle bench, clean and bright. And she wrote the date, which was the 9th of November. On the 20th, she came up with the lantern and put the light along them. 11 of the 40 had gone spotted. She stood there a long while. It was not a disaster in money, since the needles were 12 years old and worth almost nothing. But she had bought lime she could not afford, and she had been certain, and being certain had cost her 11 days. She took the tray to the window and went through it needle by needle, and the pattern in it was the thing that saved her. The spotting was worst on the needles at the north end of the tray, the end nearest the corner where she had stopped up the channel, and there was almost none at the end nearest the wall where the underfloor space was still open. She went down on her knees and pulled up the board and dragged the sack out of the channel mouth, and lay there with her arm in the space, and her cheek on the cold boards, and felt the air come back over her hand. The lime had not been the thing. The lime had been part of the thing. She had shut off the very trick she was trying to keep. Thomas Bell was 63 and lived in 2 rooms off Hillfoot with his son's family. And he had been a grinder at Harrow Fold as a young man, and then, when his chest would not let him grind any longer, a maintenance man about the buildings, until the place shut in '54. Sarah found him, because Robert Ackroyd's wife knew of him. She went up on a Sunday with half a pound of tobacco, which cost her 7 pence, and sat in a chair by his fire and asked him about the north room. He had not thought about Harrow Fold in years, and he wanted to talk about the grinding, which is what all of them wanted to talk about. He told her about the hulls and the water and the dust, and about a man named Sowden who had died at 31, and about how the wet grinders lived longer than the dry ones, and everybody knew it. And nothing was done. Sarah let him talk. Her husband had come out of a hull like that one, and she had 13 years of hearing about it, and she could wait. When she asked him again about the north room, he said the funny thing about that room was old Fenwick. Josiah Fenwick had built the finishing range in the 30s and had died in '57, and by Bell's account he was a careful, tight man who spent money where nobody else did. He would not have a fire in the finishing room, ever, not even in January, and the women worked in it, in shawls. He had the flues swept in a room that had no fire in it, which the sweep thought was a joke, and paid him to do it twice a year. He had the louver boards on the north wall renewed by a joiner, when a shutter would have cost 1/5 as much. And Bell said that Fenwick had a saying about that room which the men used to repeat at him behind his back, because the master of a needleworks talking about air was a thing they found funny in 1848. He would have it sweet and dry in there, Bell said. Sweet and dry, he used to say, and he'd have your ears if it wasn't. Sarah asked him whether Fenwick had ever had a drawing of it, and Bell said he had never seen one and doubted there was one, and that Fenwick had built half the place out of his own head and never told a man more than the man needed for that day's job. Then he went back to talking about the grinding. Sarah walked home in the dark down Infirmary Road with that one word turning over. Sweet. Not sealed. Sweet meant moving. Sweet was what a workman called air that came in from outside and went out again, air that was not the same air you had breathed all morning. Fenwick had not been trying to shut his room up. He had been trying to keep something running through it. It took her another fortnight of lifting boards and scraping limewash and standing outside in the wet with her head on one side, and at the end of it she had the whole of it, and the whole of it was simpler than she had expected. The polishing room had a floor of timber laid on low brick walls, so that the boards sat 9 inches clear of the brick raft under them, and no wet ever came up out of the ground into them. At the east end of that space, on the outside of the north wall and about a foot above the yard, there was an opening with slanted wooden boards across it, and behind the boards a sheet of zinc punched full of small holes to keep the birds and the mice and the coarse dirt out. Sarah had walked past it 4 times without seeing it, because the bird cherry had grown across the corner and a wren had built in the top of it, and leaf mold had filled the bottom third. Air came in there. It ran the length of the space under the floor, over a boarded compartment at the middle, where the lime had been kept dry in a trough. And it came up into the room through slots cut along the foot of the north wall, low down, behind where the benches stood. Then it went across the room, and out at the far end, into the narrow brick passages in the west wall, and up. The passages ran beside the flue of the chimney, all the way to the top of that stack, which was the reason the stack was too tall for the building. Warm air in a tall shaft climbs, and as it climbs it pulls whatever is behind it. There had been a boiler and a small furnace at the west end in Fenwick's day, and the flue beside those passages would have been warm most days of the week. Even now, cold and dead for 12 years, a stack that height pulls a little on its own whenever the wind gets across the top of it. That was all it was. A hole low down on the cold side, a path under the floor, a room, and a chimney to draw it out at the other end. No engine, no attendant, nothing to go wrong except blockage. Fenwick had spent his money on brick and zinc and a joiner, and had been laughed at for it, and had then done a thing his neighbors could not do. Steel does not rust in air. Steel rusts in water, and in a workshop the water arrives as damp air standing still against metal that is colder than the air is, and the damp comes out of it and sits on the surface as a bloom you can hardly see. In the rest of Harrow Fold the rain came in, and the air sat still, and every iron thing in the building sweated its way to ruin. In the north room the air never sat still, and the floor was never cold and wet from below, and the lime took the worst of the edge off what came in, and the goods on the benches stayed dry. It had not even worked properly for years. The louvre was 2/3 choked. One of the wall passages was half full of fallen brick, and the barrels in the corner had a film on their hoops, where the run of air did not reach. A room, only a part of which still worked, had held 400 needles bright through 12 winters. Sarah sat on the bench with her hands in her lap. There was nothing in that room worth 5 shillings. The needles were old pattern, and half of them had no eye punched. The benches were elm, and the trays were common deal. She was not looking at stock. She was looking at the only room in Sheffield where a woman with no capital could dry and finish fine steel better than the men who had turned her out with a pencil line. She had 11 shillings and 4pence when she started, and everything after that had to pay for the thing that came next. So she began by selling the works in pieces. Sam Pilley, 40, a scrap and brick dealer from Owlerton, came out with 2 carts on the 29th of November and took the line shafting, the pulleys, the broken cast frames from the hulls, and about 200 weight of assorted iron, and paid her £11 2 shillings for the lot. After a good deal of argument about the state of the shafting, she sold the lead from the 2 valley gutters on the south range for £3.15, and she took the roof timbers off the 2 rooms at the far end that were past saving, and Pilley took those as well. With that money she bought a roof. Hugh Naylor, 33, a slater with a bad leg and a good name, stripped and reslated the range over the north room, using the sound slate off the rooms she had given up and 200 new ones, and made the flashing good at the chimney, and charged her £4 9 shillings, and found his own nails. She had 6 panes of crown glass put into the north room windows at 8pence each, and the rest boarded properly. She paid a joiner £1 2 shillings to cut and hang new louver boards on the north wall to the pattern of the old ones, which were still there to copy, rotten but not gone. Thomas Bell came out for 4 days at 2 shillings a day and his dinner, and between them they cleared the flues. There was a bird's nest, a great deal of soot, half a barrow of fallen brick in the second passage, and a dead jackdaw. When the last of it came away, Sarah went up into the room and lit a candle at the skirting, and the flame lay over so far it nearly went out. Bell laughed at that and said Fenwick would have had them both out of the yard for letting it get in that state. She set a fresh tray of 40 needles on the middle bench on the 11th of December and left them there for 3 weeks, and there was not a spot on one of them. Then she had to find work, which was harder than any of it. There were hundreds of small firms in Sheffield doing fine steel then, and every one of them had a finishing problem in the winter, and none of them wanted to hear about it from a widow with a ruined works on the Loxley Road. She walked into town on 11 days out of 14 in December and January. She was told to write, and told the master was out, and told twice that they had women enough. A cutler on Eyre Street named Abel Cadman, 52, gave her the first work she ever took in at Harrow Fold, and gave it to her mostly to get her out of his passage. 9 dozen pairs of scissors that had come back from a customer with staining on the blades, which he had already put down as a loss. He said if she could make them fit to sell, she could have 4 shillings for the lot. She did that first job badly. She scoured them with the finest emery and soft soap and rinsed them, and she was in a hurry, and she set them on the drying rack and began polishing before the water was fully out of the joints, and 8 pairs came up with watermarks along the blade where the wet had run out of the pivot and dried. She did those 8 again at her own cost, in her own time, and she wrote in the receipt book, "Dry first." always, and count the joints. Cadman took the 9 dozen back on the 9th of January and looked at them for a long time under his window, and said nothing much, and paid the 4 shillings, and gave her 16 dozen more the following week. That was the shape of the whole of that winter. Small parcels of other men's spoiled work, taken on at prices that barely paid for the emery, done properly, and brought back on the day she had said. She could do it because of the room. Goods came out of the wash wet, went on the racks in a room where the air moved over them all day, and were dry through, and steel that is dry through when you polish it comes up clean and stays clean in the paper afterwards. By February she had more work than her own 2 hands could carry, and she took on Ellen Marsden, 42, a widow from Philadelphia, who had straightened needles at Wardlow's for 19 years and had been put off when her eyes began to go for the fine sorting, though there was nothing wrong with her hands. Sarah paid her 9 shillings a week. In March, she took on Kate Rowley, 19, at 5 shillings and 6pence, and taught her the trough and the racks. Mary came out on Saturdays and counted and papered. Bessie Crooks, 55, who kept a shop at the end of the lane, got into the way of walking up with bread twice a week and stopping to look at the trays and say they were pretty, and would not ever be persuaded to take anything for the bread. Edward Vane heard about the scrap before he heard about anything else. A letter came in the middle of March, on the firm's paper, signed by Sowerby for Vane, saying that the conveyance had passed the land and buildings only, and that the fixed plant, the shafting, the mountings and such fittings as were affixed to the fabric remained the property of the creditors, and would she hold them pending removal. Sarah had sold most of it 4 months earlier, and Vane knew it. 2 men came out with a cart on the 20th and began taking the zinc and the new Louvre boards off the north wall on the grounds that they were fittings, and Sarah came round the corner of the range with the crow in her hand and stood in front of the opening and told them that the boards had been made in January by a joiner she had paid, and that they could take her to law over 2 shillings and 9pence if they had the stomach for it. They stood about for a while and then went. She wrote to a solicitor named Micklethwaite on Fig Tree Lane, paid him 6 shillings and 8pence, and got back a short opinion that the creditors had sold and could not now unsell, which she kept in the tin with the strip of steel. Joseph Ridding, 55, made needles on Arundel Street and had done for 30 years, and in April he had 12,000 of them come back from a house in London with a note about staining and a threat about the next order. He had heard about the woman at Harrow Fold from Cadman. He drove out himself, which not one of them had done before, and walked round the north room with his hat on and put his hand down at the skirting and left it there, and looked at the racks, and asked her what she wanted. The terms were hard because he made them hard. She would take the 12,000, scour, wash, dry, polish, sort, and paper them, and he would pay £8 on delivery if his own inspector passed them, and nothing at all if the inspector did not. Sarah had £4.11 in the tin, and she spent £2.06 of it on emery, soap, paper, and lamp oil before a needle came out of the crate. They worked 11 days on that batch, the 3 of them, and Bell came up and sat by the racks and turned trays so that the air got at all of them, which was work he could do, sitting down. On the 4th day, Sarah found that the gate at the top of the cart track was locked with a new chain. The track crossed 40 yards of ground, held by the same group of creditors, and Walter Dyson, 28, who carried for her at a shilling a load and talked the whole way about his sister's wedding boots, had to go round by the Loxley Bridge, which added 2 miles and most of an hour to every load. Sarah went home and read the conveyance through twice, and on the second reading found the clause carried down out of an older deed of 1831, giving the occupier of Harrow Fold the right-of-way for carts and horses at all times over that track. She copied the clause out, walked into Bank Street with it, and put it on the table in front of Sowerby. The chain was off the gate the following morning. Ridding's inspector was a thin man named Cooper, who counted for 2 hours in the shop on Arundel Street with a glass and a lamp. On the 12th of May, he turned back 190 needles out of 12,000 for surface. Ridding told her afterwards, because he wanted her to know he had checked, that the same house had turned back better than 1,100 out of the last 12,000 he had sent them. He paid the £8 and put a second batch of 20,000 in her hands before the end of the month, at 7 shillings the thousand, and by August he was sending her all his fine work and not troubling to argue about the price. Edward Vane came out to Harrow Fold on a Tuesday in September, 1867, in a hired trap, and stood in the yard where the bird cherry had been. The gate was open because the carts were coming in twice a day, and there were 9 women working by then, 5 in the north room and 4 in the range below it, which she had roofed in July out of Ridding's money. The chimney was drawing. There were trays of finished needles on the long bench under the new glass, laid out in ranks, and the light came along them the way Sarah had learned to set a lamp 20 years before, and they were bright enough that a man coming in out of the yard had to look away from them for a moment. Vane went through the whole of the north room without saying anything. He looked at the racks and at the slots along the foot of the north wall, and then for a long time at the louvre boards outside, which his own men had tried to take off in March. Then he offered her £400 for the freehold, and said, in the same even voice he had used in Bank Street, that it was a fair price for a shell of a building on poor ground. Sarah said that the ground was poor and the building was a shell, and that neither of those things was what he was buying, and that it was not for sale. He put his hat on and went out to the trap and drove off. And that was the last time she spoke to him. She never did move into the town, and she never grew the place beyond what the site would hold. By the spring of 1870, the board on the gate read, Wain Fine Steel Finishing Works, and there were 21 people on the books, most of them women who had been put off somewhere else for being too old or too slow or too blind for the fine sorting, and there were standing contracts with Ridding, with Cadman's successor, and with 2 houses in the town that sent their best work out to Harrow Fold and their common work elsewhere. She bought a second-hand scouring and polishing frame off a failed shop in Attercliffe for £22 and had it set up in the range below. And she never put a fire in the north room, not even in January, and the women worked in it in shawls and knew why. She left the wall passages open, and when the plasterer wanted to make the north wall good, she told him to leave the slots and the blown patches as they were. And he thought she was saving the money. There was a needle in a wooden case on the shelf by the door, and in the summer of '70 a girl of 15 named Alice Whittam, who had been there a month, asked her why they kept an old one under a lid when there were 40,000 of them in the room. Sarah took it out and put it in the girl's hand and told her to set the lamp low and look along it, not across it. The girl turned it and found the line of the old bloom and the sound gray steel under it, and said it was only a needle. Sarah Wain was 36 years old, 4 months a widow, and owed £19 11 shillings. And the men who owed it paid her in a dead building and laughed while the clerk blotted the page. There was no sum they could have counted onto that table that she would have taken instead. And she said so once, to Ellen Marsden, and never again to anybody. Harrow Fold had not lasted because a fortune was hidden in it. It lasted because a difficult old man had understood what damp air does to cold metal, and because a woman nobody had thought to ask had spent 18 years learning to see it. Sarah put the needle back in its case and shut the lid, and went down to the yard, where Dyson was waiting with the cart and a great deal to say about his sister.